She left them to die in the forest. 21 years later, they stand on her doorstep. Not for revenge, but for something even more shocking. The forest was still that morning, blanketed by a thick mist that curled around the roots of towering pines. Reverie clutched the bundle tighter against her chest, every step through the tangled underbrush cutting her deeper than the thorns that snagged at her worn coat. Her heart hammered violently in her chest, and each ragged breath seemed to echo through the trees, accusing her. She stumbled once, almost falling, but kept going, driven by a desperation that drowned out every rational thought. In the bundle, her twin babies, Callan and Isolde, stirred. They made soft, mewling noises, unaware of the terrible choice that had already been made for them. Reverie stopped when she reached a small clearing where the light barely broke through. She dropped to her knees, cradling them one last time. Tears streamed down her face, blurring the tiny features she knew she would never forget. She pulled the frayed edges of the blanket tighter around them, slipping the old locket, the only thing of any value she owned, between the folds. It was tarnished and cracked, but it carried a tiny photograph hidden inside, a secret she prayed might one day guide them home. "I'm sorry," she choked out, her voice a broken whisper against the vast silence of the woods. "I don't know how to save you. I don't know how to save myself." Her fingers lingered on their soft faces, committing every detail to memory, Callan's stubborn little jaw, Isolde's barely their dimple. For a moment, Reverie hesitated, the weight of her decision pressing so hard she thought it would crush her. But the faces of those who had hurt her, the crushing poverty, the threats that would only grow worse, all those fears flooded back with paralyzing force. She kissed each child gently on the forehead, tasting the salt of her own tears on their skin. Then, before her courage failed her completely, she rose and stumbled backward, her legs shaking. She did not run. Running would have felt merciful. Instead, she forced herself to walk away slowly, to feel every step tear another piece from her soul. She dared not look back. She knew that if she did, she would fall to her knees and never get up again. Somewhere deep inside her, Reverie prayed that someone would find them before the cold night fell. That someone kinder, braver, stronger would give them the life she could not. By the time she reached the tree line, Reverie was sobbing uncontrollably, her body racked with guilt and grief. The forest swallowed the sound of her heartbreak, and as she disappeared into the mist, she left behind more than her children, she left behind the last remnants of who she had once hoped to be. The forest wore a different face by afternoon, its mist lifting into a thin gray sky. Eustace Greer trudged through the undergrowth, his boots heavy with mud and the scent of pine thick in his beard. He had spent the better part of his morning resetting traps along the northern edge of Renfield Woods, muttering to himself about the declining quality of rabbits these days. His breath hung in the air in small clouds, his joints aching from too many winters spent out in the elements. As he approached the clearing, a strange sound stopped him short, not the usual rustle of leaves or the skitter of small animals, but something softer. A cry, frail and human. Eustace frowned and pushed through the brambles, his battered rifle ready at his side, though he sensed no danger. Then he saw them. Two tiny figures, bundled clumsily in a stained blanket, their faces pinched red with cold, their small mouths open in feeble cries that barely stirred the air. Eustace stood frozen for a moment, blinking as if the forest itself were playing tricks on him. But no, the babies were real, trembling against the rough earth, alone. He knelt down slowly, his old knees protesting. Callan's little fist shot out, grasping at the air, while Isolde whimpered, her face screwed up in silent distress. Eustace swallowed hard. He had seen many strange things in his time, floods, fires, even the occasional abandoned dog, but nothing like this. His hands, calloused and clumsy, moved with unexpected gentleness as he picked them up, one under each arm. "Well, hell," he muttered to himself, shifting their weight. "What fool would leave angels like you to die out here?" He hesitated, glancing around the empty woods, half expecting someone to come charging out of the trees to reclaim them. But the only answer was the whisper of wind through the dead leaves. Eustace wrapped them tighter in the blanket, feeling the sharp jut of ribs beneath their clothes. They were too light, too fragile. Without another thought, he turned and began the long trek back toward town, muttering curses under his breath, mostly at himself for being too old to deal with something like this. When he arrived at the town orphanage, the heavy oak doors groaned open to reveal Matron Laurine standing stiffly in the entryway, her arms folded and her sharp eyes narrowing with suspicion. Eustace didn't bother with much explanation. He simply grunted, "Found him in the woods. Don't reckon they'll last another night out there." Laurine, a woman not easily moved by sentiment, looked down at the shivering twins and something in her hard expression softened. She ushered them inside with a brisk nod, calling for one of the older girls to fetch warm milk and blankets. Under the harsh yellow light of the orphanage's great hall, the twins' vulnerability was even more painfully obvious. Their faces were pale and drawn, their tiny limbs stick-thin. As the warmth crept back into their bodies, Callan clutched at Isolde's sleeve and didn't let go, even in sleep. Laurine assigned them beds in the nursery and gave them new names for the orphanage records, Callan Greer and Isolde Greer, after the old trapper who had saved their lives. Eustace didn't argue, but he made it clear he wasn't taking on the burden of raising them himself. His gift had been to deliver them into safer hands, and maybe, deep down, to quiet a part of his own heart that had known too much loneliness. That night, as the storm rolled in and the wind howled against the windows, Callan and Isolde slept curled tightly together under a patchwork quilt. They didn't know it yet, but this orphanage would be their entire world for the next 17 years, a place of survival, of small kindnesses, of invisible scars. And somewhere deep in their souls, a tiny, wordless longing began to form, a longing to understand where they had come from, and why they had been left behind. The years at the Renfield orphanage passed in a slow, grinding rhythm that shaped Callan and Isolde into survivors. The building itself was a cold, crumbling monument to forgotten promises, its long corridors lined with peeling paint and drafty windows. Matron Laurine ruled with a strict, unbending hand, fair, but never tender. In this place, affection was a scarce and precious currency, traded only in small, almost invisible acts. A warm piece of bread left at a bedside, a frayed book slipped into eager hands, a hand briefly resting on a trembling shoulder. Callan grew up with a fire in his chest, a restless, reckless spirit that no scolding could ever tame. He fought often, his fists bruised and bloodied by playground battles fought on behalf of those weaker than himself. Every slight, every injustice against him or Isolde sparked a fury he could barely contain. Teachers labeled him trouble early on, a boy destined to be lost unless something, or someone, could reach him. Isolde, by contrast, learned to be silent and sharp, folding her pain neatly away where no one could see it. She excelled in school, finding comfort in the clean order of books and facts when the rest of her life felt so uncertain. She mothered Callan in small, stubborn ways, dragging him to the infirmary when he came home bloodied, sewing up tears in his shirts by the dim light of their shared dormitory lamp. They were each other's whole world. No matter how hard things got, no matter how lonely the nights or brutal the days, Callan and Isolde knew that as long as they had each other, they could survive anything. At 17, survival meant facing the truth that had always loomed on the horizon: no one stayed in the orphanage forever. On the morning of their 17th birthday, Matron Laurine summoned them to her cramped office, her expression unreadable behind thick spectacles. "You've aged out," she said simply, sliding 2 worn envelopes across the desk. Inside each one was a small voucher for housing assistance and a contact card for a job placement agency. Nothing more. No goodbyes, no celebrations. The system had no room for sentiment. Callan smirked bitterly, stuffing the envelope into his pocket. "Guess that's that," he said. Isolde nodded, her heart twisting painfully in her chest, but she said nothing. Words had always been less important than action between them. By the next morning, Callan had hitched a ride with a traveling construction crew bound for the next state. Manual labor suited him, it gave him something to fight against, something to break besides himself. He slept rough, drank harder than he should have, and carried his anger like a second skin. But no matter how far he roamed, he kept one battered phone charged and checked it obsessively for messages from Isolde. Isolde, meanwhile, scraped together grants and scholarships and enrolled in a small nursing college an hour outside Renfield. She worked 2 part-time jobs, cleaning motel rooms during the day and waiting tables at a rundown diner at night. Exhaustion became her constant companion, but she endured it with the quiet stubbornness that had always defined her. Through everything, they stayed tethered, calls late at night when loneliness gnawed too deep, brief weekend visits when Callan's crew passed near her town. They celebrated birthdays with fast food in gas station parking lots, exchanged gifts that were mostly handmade because neither could afford much. And yet, beneath the love and loyalty they shared, there was an ache neither dared to name. A hollow place shaped like a woman's face, half remembered from a dream. A question that lingered in the spaces between their conversations: why? Why had she left them? And was she still out there, somewhere, thinking of them? Neither spoke those questions aloud. But both carried them like a weight across their shoulders, a quiet promise that one day, somehow, they would find out. It was a late evening thick with summer heat when Isolde finally packed the last of her belongings into 2 battered suitcases. Her college years had passed in a blur of exhaustion, textbooks, and endless shifts, and now she was preparing for another move, a better job offer in a small hospital upstate. She sat cross-legged on the floor of her tiny apartment, sorting through the few personal items she had bothered to keep: a cracked alarm clock, a tattered novel she had reread a dozen times, a faded photo of her and Callan sitting on the steps of the orphanage, grinning despite their bruised knees and torn clothes. At the bottom of the last box, she found it, the old blanket, worn soft from years of handling, and tangled in its folds, the locket. Isolde picked it up carefully. She had carried it with her from place to place, never quite brave enough to pry it open again. It had once been Reverie's, she was sure of it. Their mother had left them with nothing else. For years, the locket had been a symbol of abandonment, a talisman of pain. But tonight, something inside her shifted. With trembling fingers, she worked at the tiny, stubborn clasp. It resisted at first, as if reluctant to reveal its secrets. Then, with a soft metallic click, it sprang open. Inside, beneath the scratched glass, there was a picture, but not just the familiar face she remembered from childhood fragments. Carefully, she lifted the photo, realizing there was something tucked underneath. A second, smaller image, hidden all these years, a young woman with wild dark hair, green eyes that seemed too large for her face, and a small, unmistakable birthmark just above her wrist. Isolde stared at it for a long time, her chest tightening painfully. There was something hauntingly familiar in those eyes, something that made her throat close up with unshed tears. Without hesitation, she pulled out her phone and called Callan. He answered on the second ring, his voice rough from sleep or maybe from a night spent drinking. "Is everything okay?" "I found something," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "In the locket. A picture. I think it's her." There was a long silence on the other end. Then Callan exhaled sharply. "Where are you?" "Still at the apartment," she said. "But I'm leaving in the morning." "Stay there," Callan said immediately. "I'm coming." By midday the next day, Callan's beat-up truck rattled into the apartment complex's parking lot. He climbed out, looking more worn than Isolde remembered, his hair too long, his knuckles still scabbed from some recent fight, but his eyes were bright with urgency. They sat on the cracked concrete steps, shoulder to shoulder like they used to, as Isolde showed him the photograph. Callan frowned, running a thumb over the tiny image. "Green eyes," he said softly. "Like yours." "And the birthmark," Isolde added. "It has to be her." They didn't have much to go on. No names, no locations, just the image and the locket itself, old, but maybe traceable. Isolde had spent long, sleepless nights researching everything she could about finding biological family. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, notes she had been compiling in secret for months. Online search engines. Adoption registries. Missing persons databases. Reverse image searches. DNA testing. We can start here, she said, her voice shaking a little from a mixture of excitement and fear. Callan studied her for a long moment, then nodded. We start now. It was a small moment, a simple agreement between two people who had survived the worst the world could throw at them. But it changed everything. For the first time, they were not just surviving, they were fighting for answers. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the streetlights flickered to life, Callan and Isolde sat there, piecing together a plan from scraps of memory and stubborn hope. Somewhere out there, the woman who had left them behind was living a life they knew nothing about. And for the first time in their lives, they were ready to find her, no matter what it cost. The town of Renfield hadn't changed much in the years since Callan and Isolde had left it behind. It still wore the same tired face, crooked mailboxes, weather-beaten houses, sidewalks cracked like old skin. The gas station had a new sign, but the same weary clerk behind the counter. The grocery store still smelled faintly of dust and spoiled fruit. Time had moved on elsewhere, but here, it had only deepened the lines of poverty and small-town secrecy. Callan and Isolde drove into town just before noon, their truck kicking up a trail of dry dust behind them. Both felt the same tightness in their chests, the kind that came with returning to a place that had never really been home. Their first stop was the town records office, a squat brick building tucked behind the courthouse. Inside, they found an overworked clerk named Marion, who peered at them suspiciously over the top of her reading glasses. We're looking for any records on a woman who might have lived here about 21 years ago, Isolde said carefully. Young, maybe a teenager. Green eyes, dark hair. Might have lived near the woods. Marion pursed her lips. Plenty of girls like that back then. Names? We don't have one, Callan said, the edge in his voice sharper than intended. Isolde touched his arm lightly, calming him. The clerk sighed, tapping a pen against the counter. Even if you did, records that old, if they weren't official births, marriages, or deaths, might not even exist anymore. People disappear all the time, especially out near the woods. They left the office with little more than a few old address lists and the advice to try the library archives. At the library, they spent hours hunched over dusty microfiche machines, flipping through decades-old newspapers. Most of what they found were small tragedies that had already been forgotten, farm foreclosures, missing pets, the occasional obituary. No mention of a girl named Reverie. No reports of abandoned infants. It was as if their entire beginning had been swallowed whole by the town's silence. Frustrated, Callan suggested they try another angle, talking to the older residents, the ones who would remember whispers that never made it into print. They started at the diner, the unofficial gathering place for Renfield's retirees. It hadn't changed much either, cracked red vinyl booths, a jukebox that only half worked, the scent of burnt coffee lingering in the air. Isolde approached a group of elderly women playing cards near the window. She smiled politely, nerves making her palms damp. Excuse me, she said softly. We're trying to find someone who lived near the woods years ago. A young girl, maybe 15 or 16 back then. One woman, her hair a silver halo around a deeply lined face, squinted up at her. Lots of girls live near the woods. You'll have to be more specific, sweetheart. She had green eyes, Isolde added. Dark hair. A birthmark on her wrist. There was a pause, just long enough to notice. Another woman set her coffee cup down a little too hard. You don't want to dig into old business, she said, her voice tight. It won't bring you anything but hurt. The table went quiet after that. The message was clear, leave the past buried. Later, outside in the truck, Callan slammed the door so hard the entire frame shuddered. They're hiding something, he said, his voice low and furious. They know exactly who she is. Isolde leaned her forehead against the window, feeling the weight of it pressing down on her. Maybe they think they're protecting her, she whispered. Or maybe protecting themselves. But neither of them was willing to give up. Before they left town, they drove out to the edge of the forest, to the place where Eustace Greer had once found them. The clearing was overgrown now, wild with tall grasses and the twisted bones of fallen trees. The forest had tried to erase their beginning, just as the town had tried to erase Reverie. Callan stood there for a long time, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. "We'll find her," he said finally, his voice a vow. "Even if we have to tear down every wall they've built." As they stood together in the fading light, the wind whispering through the trees like distant voices, neither of them could shake the feeling that the answers they were searching for would come at a cost. But after surviving everything they already had, they were ready to pay it. The lead came unexpectedly, almost by accident. 2 days after the cold reception in Renfield, Isolde sat in the truck parked outside a crumbling motel, using a battered laptop to scan through online message boards and social media groups focused on missing family reunions. Most posts were dead ends, lost causes, but then she found it, a thread about small towns and runaway teenagers. Buried deep in the comments, a woman mentioned a girl named Reverie who had lived in Renfield and disappeared 2 decades ago, rumored to have moved to a coastal town called Merrow's Cove 3 states away. Callan leaned over her shoulder, reading it with narrowed eyes. "Merrow's Cove," he said slowly, tasting the name like it might vanish if spoken too loudly. "It's something." It was more than they had found in weeks. The next morning, without hesitation, they loaded their few belongings into Callan's truck and drove through long, empty highways toward the coast. The landscape shifted as they moved, from dry fields to winding forest roads to the sudden, sharp smell of salt in the air. Merrow's Cove appeared like a ghost town on the edge of the ocean, battered by decades of storms and neglect. Weathered houses clung to the cliffsides, their paint stripped raw by the wind. It didn't take long to find her. Isolde had printed the old photo from the locket and showed it around the handful of shops that lined the main street. Most people shook their heads without interest, but an old man sitting outside a bait shop recognized the face immediately. "Reverie Quinn," he said, scratching his beard thoughtfully. "Goes by Anna now. Lives up near the bluff in a blue house with a rusted tin roof." Isolde thanked him with trembling hands. As she climbed back into the truck, she could barely breathe. They drove up the narrow cliff road in silence. The house appeared just as the old man described, weather-beaten, the roof sagging under years of storms, but there was a small vegetable garden growing stubbornly along the side and wind chimes clinking in the breeze. Signs of a life quietly lived. Callan killed the engine, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. "You ready?" he asked finally, though his own voice was thick with something between anger and fear. Isolde wasn't sure. She could feel her heartbeat pounding in her ears, her fingers numb. But she nodded anyway. They got out of the truck and walked up the path. Callan hesitated before reaching for the door, but Isolde lifted her hand first and knocked, 3 sharp raps that echoed louder than she intended. The door creaked open after a few moments. The woman who stood there looked older than the face in the locket, but the resemblance was undeniable, the same green eyes, the same fragile bones beneath the skin, the same birthmark faintly visible on her wrist. Reverie, Anna, froze in the doorway, the screen door creaking on its hinges between them. For a moment, none of them spoke. The ocean roared distantly behind them, the wind tangling in their hair. Then Reverie's hand flew to her mouth, her knees buckling as she stumbled backward into the doorway. Tears welled instantly in her eyes, spilling over without shame. "My babies," she whispered, the words almost inaudible. "Oh God, my babies." Isolde felt her chest seize painfully at the sound. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run, she didn't know what she wanted. Callan's jaw tightened so hard that the muscles in his neck twitched. Reverie didn't reach for them. She didn't move beyond the doorway. She simply stood there, broken wide open, as if every moment of the last 21 years had crashed down onto her all at once. "I didn't know how to find you," she choked out. "I tried. I swear to God, I tried. Callan took a step back, the fury radiating off him in waves. But Isolde stayed where she was, caught between 1,000 emotions she couldn't name. Behind Reverie, the house looked small and worn, but it was clean, lived in. There were photographs on the walls, no family, but landscapes, books stacked in corners, small pieces of a life rebuilt from nothing. They had found her. After all the years of not knowing, after all the questions that had gnawed at their hearts, they were finally standing face to face with the woman who had left them behind. The moment hung between them, raw and shaking. It was not forgiveness. It was not rage. It was something more complicated. It was the beginning of the truth. The living room was small, but Reverie led them inside without a word, her hands trembling so badly she had to grip the doorframe to steady herself. Isolde followed cautiously, every step feeling like walking through a dream she didn't quite trust. Callan remained on the threshold for a long moment before finally stepping in, his arms crossed over his chest like armor. The house smelled faintly of sea air and old wood. A kettle whistled softly on the stove, forgotten. Reverie turned it off without speaking and then stood in the middle of the room, wringing her hands like a woman awaiting judgment. For a long time, no one said anything. Isolde finally broke the silence, her voice raw. Why? It was a single word, but it contained 21 years of pain, abandonment, and unanswered questions. Reverie's face crumpled. She sank into the worn armchair by the window and stared down at her hands, ashamed. I was 17, she said hoarsely. I had no one. No family. Your father. She shook her head, struggling for words. He was dangerous. Violent. When I found out I was pregnant, I knew I had to get away. But by then it was too late. He controlled everything. Money. Friends. Me. She swallowed hard, her voice breaking. When you were born, I thought, maybe it would change. Maybe he would see you and it would soften him. It didn't. It got worse. Callan's mouth twisted into a sneer. So you abandoned us in the woods like trash. Reverie flinched but didn't argue. I thought someone would find you. Someone better than me. Someone who could give you what I couldn't. I didn't leave you to die. Tears ran freely down her face now. I left you to survive. Isolde gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles white. Part of her wanted to scream at Reverie, to punish her for every lonely night, every scar, every time she had wondered why she wasn't good enough to be loved. But another part, the part still desperate for answers, leaned in closer. You never came back, Isolde whispered. I tried, Reverie said, her voice cracking. God, I tried. I went back to the woods the next day, but you were gone. I searched every orphanage, every hospital in 3 counties. I didn't even know if you were alive. And later I didn't know if you would even want to see me. Callan turned away, pacing the room like a caged animal. His hands balled into fists at his sides. You have no idea, he said, his voice low and dangerous, what we went through. I know I don't, Reverie said, tears soaking into the collar of her shirt. And I will never forgive myself for it. The room was suffocating with grief and anger and guilt, emotions so thick they seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Isolde pressed the locket into her palm so hard that the edges bit into her skin. She looked at Reverie, this woman who was supposed to have been their mother, who had been a ghost hovering at the edges of their entire lives, and felt something complicated rise inside her. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe the first tiny crack in the wall she had built around her heart. You could have fought harder, Callan said harshly. I know, Reverie whispered. I know. Silence fell again, heavy and aching. Finally, Reverie looked up at them, her green eyes bloodshot but clear. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to stay. But if you want to know me. I'll tell you everything. Every awful, shameful thing. You deserve the truth. Isolde's throat tightened painfully. She looked at Callan, whose face was a battleground of emotions, rage, sorrow, confusion. She didn't know what he would choose. She barely knew what she would choose herself. But after a long moment, she heard her own voice say, barely above a whisper, "We'll stay. For now." It wasn't an acceptance. It wasn't a surrender. It was a beginning. A beginning carved out of heartbreak and ruin, but a beginning nonetheless. As the sun set beyond the cliffs, casting long shadows across the battered house, Callan and Isolde sat down. Reverie began to speak, her voice shaking but honest, opening the old wounds that had never truly healed. And for the first time in 21 years, they listened. The days that followed were slow and jagged, like walking barefoot across broken glass. Reverie told them everything, holding nothing back, the years of fear living under their father's shadow, the night she ran, the strangers who turned their backs when she asked for help. She spoke of the guilt that never loosened its grip on her, the nightmares that replayed that morning in the woods over and over in her mind, the quiet life she built in Marrow's Cove not because she had moved on, but because she didn't know how else to survive. Callan listened with clenched fists and a jaw so tight it seemed like he might snap under the pressure. Some nights, he couldn't stay in the house. He would disappear for hours, pacing the cliffs until the cold drove him back. Anger lived in him like a second heartbeat, anger at her, at the world, even at himself for needing to hear her voice so badly after all the years of pretending he didn't care. Isolde absorbed everything in painful silence. She asked questions when Callan couldn't. What was our first word? What were we like as babies? Did you ever think about trying to find us again? Reverie answered them all, sometimes with tears, sometimes with a voice so hoarse it barely made it across the room. She kept no illusions about herself. She didn't beg. She didn't plead for their forgiveness. She only gave them the one thing they had never been given before, the full, ugly truth. Slowly, something began to shift. It started small. Isolde found herself lingering in the kitchen as Reverie cooked, watching her movements, the way she always set aside the burnt pieces of toast as if she still expected someone else to get the better ones. Callan, against his own stubborn will, found himself fixing a broken step on the porch one afternoon, grumbling the whole time but not leaving. They ate together at night, not because they had to, but because some quiet part of them all needed to sit at the same table, even if no one spoke much. The rift between them was enormous. It could not be undone by apologies or even love. But it could be bridged, one painful, hesitant step at a time. One evening, a storm rolled in off the ocean, battering the cliffs with rain and howling wind. Power flickered out in the house, leaving them in near darkness, the only light coming from a few old candles Reverie found tucked away in a drawer. They sat together in the living room, wrapped in blankets, listening to the storm rage outside. Without thinking, Reverie reached out and took Isolde's hand. For a moment, Isolde stiffened, and then, slowly, she let herself lean into the touch. Across the room, Callan watched, his face unreadable in the flickering light. After a long moment, he shifted closer too, stretching his legs out toward the fire. No words were spoken. None were needed. In the morning, when the storm had passed and the sun broke through the clouds in fragile beams, the three of them stood outside, looking out over the gray, churning ocean. The world smelled clean, washed raw by the rain. "I know I can't make up for what I did," Reverie said, her voice quiet but steady. "But if you'll let me. I want to be part of your lives now. However you'll have me." Isolde looked at Callan. He looked at her. 1,000 conversations passed between them without a word. The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't clean. But it was real. Callan nodded first, almost imperceptibly. Isolde smiled, small and trembling but real. "One step at a time," she said. Reverie laughed then, a soft, broken laugh that sounded more like a sob, and wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. She didn't ask for more. She knew better now. As they walked back toward the house, the wind tugging at their clothes, there was no perfect reconciliation, no magical erasing of the past. There was only three people, scarred and stubborn, choosing, however cautiously, to move forward together. And sometimes, in a world that too often breaks and abandons, that choice alone is the closest thing to a miracle. This story was never about perfect forgiveness or the fantasy of an easy reunion. It was about something much harder, the decision to move forward while carrying the weight of everything that came before. Callan, Isolde, and Reverie are all deeply scarred people, shaped by abandonment, survival, and unbearable guilt. None of them could undo what had happened. But they could choose to stand in the wreckage together and slowly, painfully, begin to build something new. I wanted the ending to feel real, not wrapped in artificial sweetness, but rooted in the difficult beauty of human resilience. True healing doesn't erase pain, it acknowledges it, honors it, and chooses to walk alongside it without being ruled by it. In that sense, the final moment, when they simply agree to try, one step at a time, is more powerful than any dramatic reconciliation could ever be. It's a quiet miracle, not forgetting the past, but refusing to let it dictate the future.